Chapter 36. The New Dead. The world around him was engulfed in white. It fell past on every side, a roaring waterfall broken up by tumbling boulders of snow. They didn't hurt much when they hit him, only broke into smaller chunks and continued to plummet past his feet. He looked upward. Wings spread wide and beak pointed toward the sky. Firebird glowed so brightly, the snow around him looked dim blue by comparison. The only part of him not flickering with white-hot light was his bare black legs, and the talons that gripped Jack's shoulders. They caught mostly Jacket, but their razor-sharp points pressed firmly against his collarbones. Soon they broke into daylight. They passed through the narrow gap between the gate doors, over the mound of snow spilling through, and landed softly next to the inactive ice cat. Heart still hammering, Jack fell to a seated position in the snow. Thank you, he panted. The falcon's flames dimmed, licking with finality from between feathers, and Firebird was replaced by Grayson Conway. He nodded, watching the gap in the gate expectantly. Jack sat for a moment, catching his breath. "How are you here?" he asked. Seeming satisfied that nobody was coming through, the falcon turned to Jack and indicated a small device attached to his waist. It had a dark green display on which several blinking dots were visible. "Your tracker finally kicked in," he explained. "Once we saw you were alive, we rushed back. The others came by Annex. They may be a while behind." He jerked his head toward the gate. "So you want to tell me what happened here?" Jack explained everything. The fall of the fort, the death of Claythorne, the horned monster, Greenridge's betrayal. He explained about the Farrells, Harding, and the army behind the wall. When he was finished, Conway seemed to consider this information. He then looked Jack up and down. The sound of engines roared from the direction of the forest, and Farrell snowbikes pulled into the clearing, one by one sputtering to silence. "Jack!" Sprint called. He dismounted from behind one of the coyotes and zipped across the snow, spraying the pair of them as he came to a sliding halt. "Oh, sorry," he said, seeing the annoyed look on Conway's face. Then he turned to Jack. "You're all right," he laughed. "Shoot, how many times are we going to be saying that in our careers?" He looked past Jack, seeing the partly opened gate and the spill of fresh snow. "Wow, did you do that?" he asked, amazed. Jack raised his paws and wagged them. "Ta-da!" Hoover, Willie, and Maddie trudged through the snow to where they stood. "So it's over then?" Maddie asked, looking toward the gap in the gate. "Not quite," Conway said, his stern eyes still fixed on Jack. Then he seemed to soften. "There's still the fort. Dixon and the others are headed there now. But he stopped abruptly. A palpable silence had fallen. Every approaching Farrell stopped in their tracks. Hoover's eyes grew wide. Maddie looked as though she might be sick. "Oh, what in the world?" Sprint groaned. Conway spun around. Jack did the same, and his legs instantly felt weak. Greenridge stood in the gap between the gate walls, looming down on the crowd from the mound of snow that had spilled through. Only he didn't look like Greenridge. He looked broken and misshapen. One arm hung further down than the other. His head rested loosely against his shoulder, and his knees turned inward as if he was being supported from behind. Just like the pink headless creatures, Jack thought he looked as though he was suspended on great strings coming down from the clouds overhead. His teeth were bared, his eyes were wide, fixed madly on empty air. Wind whistled through the gap, a mournful, ghostly sound, and for a moment Greenridge's undead body simply stood there like a nightmarish statue. Then someone, bobbed up to his left, then his right, then more. The gap began to fill with limping, broken bodies of the avalanche victims. "Puppets," Jack thought once more. There was a cackle of laughter from overhead. Jack looked, and so did everyone else. Cutting against the cloudy sky, the cloaked, skull-headed creature grinned down at them from the top of the wall, those perfect circle eye sockets seeming to take them all in. The creature lifted the sack it carried into the air, and from it emitted a shrill war cry. As the cry continued, the creature lobbed the sack from the brink of the wall. It fell through the air, the yell growing louder, and landed with a thump 20 yards from the line. The sharp black tip of a beak protruded from the darkened opening. "Gordon," Conway said, a bitter note in his voice. The undead soldiers burst from the gate, pouring out like fluid, charging down the mound. A cacophony of shrieks filled the canyon, echoing off the walls. Terrified, Jack turned to Conway. "What do we do?" he yelled over the noise. "What do you think?" Conway yelled. "Run!" But instead of turning with them, he looked upward and burst into the air, straight for the horned creature. "Let's go!" Sprint said, grabbing Hoover by the arm. "Jack, what are you waiting for? Let's go!" Jack took his eyes away from the top of the gate, turned, and followed the others as they did their best to run through the snow. Like the rest of them, Jack's movements were slow and labored. He felt like he was wading through shallow water. Ahead, it seemed the entire feral camp had come out, ready for war. They stood their ground in several uneven rows. Their weapons were as mismatched as their clothing, everything from wood-carved spears to old-fashioned rifles. Armel, the bear-like coyote, stood before the rest, his sons, Sasha and Ramses, at his sides. Jack glanced over his shoulder as he ran. The undead climbed over each other, stepping on the backs of the fallen, crushing them into the snow. They were gaining. Jack and the others reached the line of the ferals and turned. A blinding white light arched up from the gate, passing over the approaching army. Conway landed near Armel and his sons. His flames died out, and he shook his head, tossing something big and white at their feet. The horned skull. "There was nothing under that costume, just a bunch of bones." "We didn't come here to fight an unstoppable army," Sasha said.
"He's right,"
Armel shouted, gripping his rifle anxiously.
"We can't beat an army that's already dead."
"Well, you can't outrun them either," Conway said. Armel considered this, then gave a defeated nod.
"Hold your ground!"
he shouted. "Jack, what are you doing?" Conway yelled. "I told you to run! Now!" "No, we want to fight," Jack argued. Since he'd entered that code, he felt a certain hardening within him. He'd really done something now, really saved the day. He wasn't about to turn and flee. "I'm not a coward," he said. Conway fixed him with a stern look. "We can't beat this army, Jack," he said in little more than a whisper. "Everyone here is about to die, and I won't have 5 children dying with us." Then he burst into white flame and spoke in that godlike voice he'd used at the honey sap.
"Now go!"
There wasn't time to argue. Jack turned helplessly toward the approaching army. They charged in a tight cluster, a great black wall of claws and teeth, growling, roaring, chomping, snarling. "You heard him," Sprint said, shoving Hoover from behind. They moved through the crowd of coyotes until they came out the other side. Ahead, pure snow stretched out before a forest of white-powdered trees sparkling in the sunlight. Safety. Behind them, the sound of gunfire, clashing weapons, and screams broke the peaceful illusion. "Everyone here is about to die." Jack came to a stop, staring ahead. "Jack," Sprint said, releasing Hoover and turning back. "Jack, what are you doing?" "This isn't who we are," Jack said. The others stopped and turned also. "We can't run and hide the moment things get dangerous." "Jack," Maddie reasoned, "did you see Greenridge? Did you see his men? They're not even alive. They're like machines. Even if I could see direct sunlight, it might not stop them. It might only stop the ferals in Conway. What good would that do?" "Being a hero is not about Hytena, it's about heart," Jack quoted. "King of Hearts." and despite his fears, he smiled. "Maybe you've heard of him?" Maddie opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. Willie sighed resignedly, then moved to Jack's side. "You're right. He's right. We can't hide. We're heroes." Hoover gulped and nodded, then joined them. He shrugged apologetically to Sprint, who rolled his eyes and followed. Maddie stared at them, then turned toward the open snow. "If you want to leave, that's okay," Jack said. "The 4 of us are going back." Maddie folded her arms across her chest and glared at him, but her mouth twitched. "You mean the 5 of us," she said. "Team evaluation and all that." Jack smiled, but before he could turn, Hoover pointed toward a line of trees to their left. "Isn't that Peter Claythorne?" Jack followed his outstretched claw. The white wolf was sitting in the bowl below a tree, his back pressed to the trunk. "Hiding again?" Sprint said, disbelieving. "Shoot, that guy's a real hero." "But if he's afraid," Jack voiced, "why isn't he running?" And there was something else. His eyes were open, staring transfixed, as if he was in some kind of hypnosis, and held out in front of him were both paws, their fingers splayed out as if manipulating a puppet. "It's him!" Jack said, taking off in the direction of the trees. "It's Peter! He's doing this!" The others raced to catch up. Sprint was by his side immediately. "What do you mean?" "I mean he is the horned creature. Didn't you hear Conway? There wasn't anything under that cloak. It was a puppet. So the first night we saw it, somebody had to be controlling it. And who came to your rescue at the lake?" Understanding, Sprint zipped off toward Peter. Just as he entered the shade of the trees, something swung out from behind a trunk and clotheslined him, sending him pinwheeling into the snow. He skidded to a halt on his face, unmoving. "Miles!" Hoover cried, picking up pace, but he stopped short. They all did, as a figure emerged from behind the tree. His brown fur was matted, and he had that same lopsided posture, the same lifeless expression on his face. "I thought I might need protection," Mr. Bear said, only it didn't sound like Mr. Bear. The voice was wheezing, as if the air was being squeezed out rather than spoken, just like the voice from the sack. Trembling, Jack looked past the reanimated body of their handler. Peter still had his back to the tree, still wore a transfixed expression, still held his paws in front of him as though manipulating a marionette. "Why are you doing this?" Jack yelled. "Your army is already dead! You've lost!" A high, cold laugh erupted from Bear's mouth. "Yes," the voice said. "I really should thank you for that. I confess I was in over my head with the invasion plan. Perhaps too much faith was placed in me." "By Brisk?" Jack asked, trying to see Peter from around Bear. "President Brisk is a fool. Foolish enough to believe this invasion was his idea. A red-teeth rebirth that would scare the nation, have them begging him to access the Alpha Hytena. And while he thought he was manipulating me, it was truly my master who was manipulating him." Edging slowly to the left, Jack tried to keep Peter talking. "But you were an apprentice, a hero!" The voice issuing from Bear's mouth became cold. "You all think being an apprentice is a dream come true," he snarled. "For me it was a nightmare, just a way for my mother to pawn me off, make me someone else's problem. Please don't move," he barked, and Bear's head snapped toward Maddie. She stopped midway through a step backward. "I loved my father," the voice continued. "The sickness that took him, it worked quickly. I never even got to say goodbye. Imagine my surprise to wake up from a dream about better times, only to find him standing beside my bed." Bear's face did not change, but the voice became wistful. I had my father back. Of course, I didn't realize at first that it was me doing it. My sadness, my pining, reanimating his dead body. But my mother... His pensive tone was replaced with hollow disgust. She locked me away, both horrified and ashamed of what I had done. Punished me for the simple crime of loving my father too much to let him go. Then her advisor, Gordon, suggested the apprenticeship program. She couldn't be happier with the solution. But where my mother and Gordon saw me as filth to be swept under the rug, my master saw my true potential. He incorporated me into his plan, a train hijacking that would end King's life. Jack froze. Train? Yes, the voice said. Your lion friend, King's cousin, was so overflowing with envy, so bitter about being rejected from King's team, he sold him out, sold us his weakness, a broken heart. This information positioned me perfectly. My mentor was White Stripe, the badger from King's team. I saw firsthand King's interactions with his own sidekick, and knew that they'd become quite close, very much like a father and son. So you killed his sidekick to break his heart? Oh, it's better than just that, the voice said with oily satisfaction. I was on the train that day. I had the apprentice brought on board. I made them fight. Jack remembered the anguished roar King had issued from the roof of the train. All of this because you wanted King's power? It's not King's power. It's the power. The Alpha Hyena. King was merely a vessel, a jar to contain the power. My master had to break him in order to take it. Well, he failed, Jack said, surprised to hear the laughter in his own voice. You failed! King beat you both! Before he died, he hid his power where you'll never reach it. You want the key, right? Well, I don't have it anymore. It's gone. Sorry. In the distance beyond the forest, the sounds of battle grew louder and closer. Screams, gunshots, the clanging of metal. The sapling, the voice inferred. Then it laughed that horrible, shrill laugh again. And now we come to it, the voice said, tremulous with excitement. The big secret. Surely you don't think you're here by coincidence, Jack. Surely you don't believe your pathetic little team of porters actually qualified as Vanguard's sidekicks. I wanted you here. The moment I met you, I understood. Understood what? Jack spat. That I could open the gate for you? No. Although the gate did confirm my suspicion. Perhaps you noticed today that when you triggered the avalanche with your code, there weren't any explosions. The snow just did what you wanted it to do. What are you saying? Dr. Walraven has been hiding you away all these years. His own private secret. The sapling is a fake. You have the alpha power, Jack. His head suddenly light. Jack saw the train wreck play out in his memory, as though watching it through a long tunnel. He had been soaring through the air, clutched tightly in King's arms. The engine was toppling end over end just behind them as they crashed through the stone wall of an old chapel. He had blacked out, woke up in Dr. Walraven's arms. But there was something between, some narrow sliver of memory, like a single photograph spliced between frames of a film reel. So minuscule, it had never before surfaced in his attempts to block out that horrible day. He'd been shut in blackness beneath the train. Arms pressed the engine up and off of him in a dead lift. But the arms weren't King's. They were Jack's. His memory was interrupted as Willie made a move. He leapt for the nearest tree, landed high up the trunk, and shot his tongue toward Peter. But a paw snatched the tongue as easily as if it were an underhanded pitch. "No!" Hoover howled. Sprint, his face fixed in a hollow stare, jerked the tongue. Willie was yanked bodily through the air. He connected with an opposing tree with a loud thud, then collapsed to the ground. Bear moved to Sprint's side, the two of them blocking Peter from view. And then they spoke together in an eerie drone.
"The red teeth will rise again. Safe haven is only a spark, but the flame is coming, and when it does, Nicatia will burn to ashes."
The two of them sniffed the air dramatically.
Delicious ashes.
"Maddie," Jack said, "get to the sun. Stopping him will stop them all." Maddie turned to leave the shade of the trees, but Bear lunged for her. He grabbed her around the arms, lifting her kicking into the air.
"I don't think so," the voice said.
Hoover made a move toward Peter, but Sprint zipped in front of him. "Not so fast, fatso!" Not knowing what he planned to do, Jack darted toward Peter. He was caught around the ankle and tumbled to the ground. Willie's tongue released, and the frog tackled him.
"Would you please stop distracting me?" he seethed.
Willie wasn't particularly heavy, but he was strong. He pinned Jack's arms behind his back as if placing him under arrest, shoving his head into the snow. Jack struggled against the restraint, rolled his face to the side. Hoover, still blocked by Sprint, wore an expression of deepest anguish. "You're my best friend," he said. "You've always been there for me."
"Fatty,"
Sprint sneered.
"Blubberbutt."
"I know it's not you talking," Hoover continued, raising his voice over the string of insults. "But I hope you're in there somewhere, listening."
"Thunder thighs."
"I didn't want to be a hero," Hoover continued. His voice rattled, as though the words and what it cost to speak them was taking everything he had. "I wanted to be a writer, like my dad. But you said something to me, something you meant as a joke, but which I hope, that deep down you really meant."
"Did I tell you what a walrus you are?" Sprint mocked. "Because I wasn't joking."
"No," Hoover said, and he took a step toward his friend. "You said that in a fight, I'd kick your ass." He raised his snout like the barrel of a rifle.
Crack!
The noise of the blast made Jack's ears ring. Sprint flew through the forest, crashing into the snow somewhere out of sight. The anguished look replaced with deepest rage, Hoover turned toward Peter. For a fraction of a second, the wolf came back to himself, his eyes focusing fearfully on Hoover.
Crack!
Peter was blasted backward, straight through the trunk of the tree against which he had been positioned. Splinters filled the air as the tree fell forward. Peter smacked against a second tree, bringing the snow down upon himself, and was buried. Instantly, Bear and Willie collapsed like marionettes whose strings had been clipped. Jack pushed out from beneath Willie's unconscious figure. Fighting his own wobbling legs, he stood and moved to Hoover's side. "Are you okay?" Hoover gave a single, slow nod. "And Sprint?" Jack asked, looking in the direction the squirrel had flown. "He's alive," Hoover said. He turned toward the jagged remains of the fallen tree. The air was thick with splintery confetti as bits of wood drifted toward the ground. "High and low settings," he said, smiling tearfully.